Hey everybody! It is time for our yearly Flash Fiction Contest, judged by you, the listeners. So if you want to be part of this, either as a judge or an author, you'll want to register at our forums at escapepod.org and check out all the information there. Submission window will be open from April 1st through April 15th. We can't wait to see what you have submitted, and we also can't wait to see what you guys decide are the best ones. So, check it out. More information at escapepod.org.
Escape Pod, Episode 724, The Season of the Storm, by Jonathan Edelstein.
Hello and welcome to Escape Pod, your weekly science fiction podcast. I'm Divya, your host for this episode. Our story this week is The Season of the Storm by Jonathan Edelstein. This is an Escape Pod original. Jonathan Edelstein was born in 1971, is married with Kat, and lives in Queens. In addition to a previous publication in Escape Pod, The Starsmith, episode 538, his work has appeared in Beneath Ceaseless Skies, Strange Horizons, Daily Science Fiction, and elsewhere. His literary heroes include Chinua Achebe, Ursula Le Guin, and Bernard Cornwell. And when he isn't writing, he practices law and hopes someday to get it right. Your narrator this week is Maxine Moore. Maxine is a creative who has dabbled in a variety of fields, including theater, radio, photography, and now voice acting. She can often be found watching movies and arguing about them, drinking tea, traveling, or enjoying a good book. She lives with her husband in the Washington, D.C. area. Now, get ready to collect some alien samples, because it's story time.
The Season of the Storm, written by Jonathan Edelstein, narrated by Maxine L. Moore. 20 kilometers outside of Colosso Station, we stopped for gas. The Titan rover turned, and Mizozi steered for a group of outcroppings. There were more of those now that we were getting to the uplands north of Kraken Mare. She slowed and stopped beside one of them, a cairn of ice rocks fused into a column, half again my height. "Elias," she said, "let's cut some." My eyes flickered to the dashboard display. We're not low. Never hurts to top it off, and we'll be up there a couple of days. Mizozi was like that. She liked her margins of error large, and she'd never be satisfied with the gauges at 80% when they could be 100. She wasn't going to change, and her habits had saved her lives a time or two, so I didn't argue. Instead, I opened the door and jumped down. There was a toolbox on the rover's flatbed with the word Banda scrawled on it in an ancient marker. Mizozi opened it and took out an ice pick and hammer, and I did the same with the box labeled Yaluma. A breeze was blowing and stirring the dust and ice particles on the ground, raising even more of a burnt orange haze than usual in Titan's sky. Enough dust was in the air that I had to wipe the faceplate of my suit, and I had the sensation of being in a cloud. I leapt into it, a single bound, and gravity 1/7 of what I'd been born under, took me to the middle of the cairns. Out of habit, I looked for vinyl bugs. Out of habit, even longer standing, I also looked for signs of cryovolcanism. There were none of either. The outcroppings seemed to be an icefall from higher up, rather than an upwelling, and the telltale signs we'd come to associate with the maybe microbes were absent. Satisfied that I was looking at nothing but dirty ice, I cut a chunk from the nearest part of the pile and carried it back to the rover. Mzozi already had the icebox cover open, and I added my piece of the rock to what was inside. 3 more trips and 3 more cuttings, and the box was full. Deep within the box, the ice would be melted slowly. The meltwater fed into an electrolysis plant, and the resulting oxygen injected into the engine. The internal combustion engine. The engine we were using, in the year of our Lord 2068, a billion miles from home, to burn the methane that lay in lakes 100 meters deep, all over Titan's northern latitudes. Mzozi shifted the rover out of neutral, and I still didn't think she needed to worry. Every kilogram of ice would yield enough oxygen to get us 2 kilometers, and 10 kilos would keep the motor going through the night to generate heat. We had at least 100 kilos of ice in the box. Better to worry about the methane tanks, the other gas. Those would be harder to replace up in the hills. But Mzozi did like her margins of error, and there was something about the haze I couldn't quite put my finger on. We were moving again, and the rover bumped over the scree of ice rocks and into a dry riverbed. The gully led up an increasingly steep slope, though still a gentle one by the standards of the home world. The highest mountains on Titan would only be hills on Earth. The air grew hazier, at times obscuring the bulk of Saturn at the near horizon, and a craggy ridgeline loomed in orange fog. If Luando is right, we should find them up here, Mzozi said. The new vinyl bugs? She nodded. The wind she picked them up on was blowing in this direction. All kinds of new things in the wind. Mzozi laughed, and I imagined the smile forming behind her faceplate. That should be a song. The windy season? The cold gust of spring? The ice god's breath, I said. But that breath was bringing new things. For the 15 years of South Polar summer, the northern lake country had been calm and quiescent. But now the season was changing. The surface was growing warmer. Evaporation from the seas was increasing, and the methane-laden winds were blowing harder. One of those winds a month ago had blown dust from the uplands, and in that dust, Luando Mwambi had found a vinyl bug, of a kind no one had ever seen before. Vinyl bugs. They weren't vinyl, and they weren't bugs, but when the unmanned American submarine found them 25 years ago, the Crown Mind named them within hours. They were simple cells with vinyl cyanide membranes, methane cytoplasm, and networks of giant lipid molecules. They had no nucleus, but the lipid structures seemed like they might be organelles. There were some to make compounds from hydrocarbons and some to break them down, storage chambers that might be vacuoles, webs of filaments that appeared to transmit impulses. They were dispersed across the lake's surfaces, but we still weren't sure if they were alive or not. There were no signs of a reproductive cycle, and they didn't seem to react to each other's presence. If they were alive, we all wanted them to be, and so did a lot of people back on Earth. Living, reproducing microbes could be engineered. Maybe we could make some that could break down methane at 95 Kelvin, the way our imported bacteria did at 300, and we could move Colosso Station's plastics factory outside. Back home, if we could ensure against contamination, there were endless uses for life forms that could survive temperatures so cold. Aiding in cryoprocessing or removing impurities from cryomilling. Maybe there would even be space applications. The Zambian government would own half our patents, but there would be more than enough to go around. Maybe whatever was waiting in the uplands, with an organelle that the sea bugs didn't have, could tell us. Stop daydreaming, Elias, Mzozi said, as if she hadn't been doing the same thing. I noticed that the rover had stopped, and the ground looked different up ahead. We'd better take a look before we keep going. In a moment, we were both outside, and there was something different about the surface. Something black formed patchy, fractal patterns, growing larger and closer together as we looked up the valley. We approached them, keeping our movements slow in the microgravity, and I knelt beside one of the smaller patches and took a careful scraping. I guessed what it was before my faceplate's microscopic setting dialed in on it. Vinyl bugs, I said. Colonies, maybe. They didn't come in colonies on the lakes. We should get the rover out of the gully, said Mizozi. If they're this thick here, we don't want to disturb them. She drove slowly over the lip of the riverbed, and we continued upward beside it. We were only a kilometer or two from the ridgeline, and both of us could see that the patches were very large now. There were blankets of vinyl bugs, stromatolites of them, stretched halfway across the stream floor. Let's stop here, both of us said at once. With the rover parked just above the gully, we knelt again in the midst of mystery. Mizozi took another sample and ran it through a test kit, and I heard a grunt of surprise over the suit radio. Adhesive, she said. They're attached to the surface and to each other. I processed that for a moment. I guess we know what that extra organelle is for. That's not all it might be for. The adhesive is being broken down. You said being broken down? They're secreting something. That's the only word I've got for it. And it's breaking down the glue. They're letting go. I thought of Luyondo's windblown bug. Maybe the letting go had been happening for a month. The carpets of vinyl bugs were fraying with the new season. That might be what they're reacting to, the change of seasons, changing winds, temperature, air pressure. How long until all the adhesive is gone? At the rate they're secreting, it could be a few days, maybe longer. They're reacting to something then. At Titan's temperatures, a few days was lightning speed. Mizozi didn't answer, but carried her sample up to the rover. There were more tests we could run there, and others that we could apply to the vinyl bugs in situ. We'd been studying the Kraken mare bugs for 2 years, and we'd fed all that learning into our test kits. But the station had much more sophisticated equipment, and the first priority was to store the samples for transportation and tell them what we've seen. I dug out containers of methane medium and filled them as carefully as I could, and Mizozi stored an image for transmission. Base to 3, came a crackling voice acknowledging receipt. Looks like you found something. You can say that again, Victoria. What we've found, I'm not quite sure. It'll drive Luando crazy that she's not up there. Tell her to stand on the roof, and we'll scatter some to the winds for her. You can tell her yourself, 3. Anything else? We'll let you know tomorrow. 3 out. I finished my task just as Mizozi completed hers, and we stood outside the rover and looked down for a moment. 40 kilometers away and 800 meters below, the lights of Colosso Station were just visible, and beyond them, the methane seas and icy islands of Kraken Mare. I realized, as I took in the view, how tired I was. Let's call it a day, I said. We still called 24 hours a day, though it had nothing to do with either Titan's or Saturn's rotation, and we went to get the tent. You can't really live off the land in Titan. Much as we like to brag that, take off your suit outside and you'll find that out very quickly. But you can come closer than anywhere else outside the home world. There's unlimited fuel in the methane lakes and unlimited water ice to juice for oxygen. And when we make the ice into drinking water, we can synthesize hydroponics chemicals from the salts that precipitate out. We can make plastics from the methane too, with a little help from bacteria we'd brought from home. so we're never short of fodder for the 3D printers. And, with an atmosphere half again as thick as Earth's, there's no need for pressurized housing. If you've got heat and air, you can pitch a tent. The tent Mizozi and I put up wasn't as low-tech as it looked. It was sealed tighter than a lion drum, double layered with a vacuum between to keep the cold out, and had a hose to bring in air from the electrolysis plant on the rover. But watching it inflate and driving stakes into the ice with a hammer felt low-tech. And when I lay on its floor in my indoor clothes and looked on Saturn looming heavy through the cloud cover, I felt like I was a child again, camping at Chilengua Nalesa and gazing at the stars. We cleaned the suits and did our microgravity exercises, and Mizozi sat reading The Left Hand of Darkness, while I looked for patterns in the sky as I'd done when I was a child. It was a different sky, but the distance from here to infinity was the same. I watched the clouds move across Saturn's visage and form the shape of a bird, a tree, a great orange starship. I wondered if anything was moving through those clouds now. An American lander, maybe, bringing materials and construction robots for the base they were building on Lake Garamere. I'd seen its foundations once. It had been building for 10 years already, and when it was finished in another 8, it would house 100 people and have all the comforts of home. They said the Chinese station and the Southern Hemisphere would be like that too, and the ones that India, Europe, and Nigeria had just started to build. Their people would live in palaces. Colossal Station wasn't a palace, but we were here. We weren't waiting for the robots to build a castle for us. We were the ones who were used to doing things on a shoestring, and we were the ones who realized that on Titan, a shoestring was enough. We might have hitched a ride on a Chinese supply launch. We might have reached back to the 20th century for our motors. We might have cut to the bone and beyond to get the most out of the mass allowance China lent us. We might have to thumb a ride back home a few years from now, but we were here. Before NASA, before the ESA, before ECOWAS Space, we were the first humans to explore Titan in the flesh, and its secrets, if there were any to be found, would be ours. The hare does win the race sometimes. Dreaming of biological treasure, I drifted off to sleep. In the morning, we went back down to the riverbed to see how far the vinyl bug colonies extended. 100 meters up from the rover, they began to get thinner, and they petered out entirely as the stream split into hundreds of small wadis that ran from the highest points of the mountain. We marked where the summit was, 80 meters above, and made our way back systematically, recording and cataloging and looking for variations between samples. "Something's happening," Mizozi said 3 hours later. I stopped short. Those are never words anyone wants to hear on a hostile world, especially in the tone that Mizozi said them. But whatever she'd seen was happening to the vinyl bugs, and not to us. And I let out the breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "The adhesive is dissolving much faster," she said. "They're secreting a lot more of the solvent. They'll be completely unanchored in a couple of hours." "Let's take an environmental snapshot," I answered. "This solvent might be useful. And if so, we needed to know the conditions under which the vinyl bugs produced it." I took a reading of the temperature, wind speed, air pressure. "Come over here, Mizozi. The bottom just dropped out of the barometer." She got up, startled, and came to look at my readings. She took out her own data unit, ran it, shook her head, and ran it again. "I'm getting the same thing. We're not looking for a storm, though. Not this early in the polar spring." "No, we're not," I agreed, but neither of us were convinced. There was so much about this place we still didn't know. I suddenly wished that the weather satellite that the Chinese planned to orbit when their base was finished was already up there. "Get back to the rover," I said. But Mizozi had already made a great leap out of the stream bed, and I could only follow. "3 to base," she was saying when I got there. "3 to base. Can you hear me, Victoria?" "Base to 3. You're breaking up a little, but I can hear you. What's the problem?" "Give me your air pressure readings." "No problem," Victoria said. I could hear her puzzlement, but there was a clatter of keys being pressed, and a moment later, her voice was altogether different. "I've got 143.5 kilopascals and dropping. Normal was 146.7. "You've got the same?" "Lower. We're heading into the 142s. I could hear keys punching again. If it were that much below normal at home, we'd be looking at a gale, maybe a cyclone. I looked up from the radio and out the rover window, and while it wasn't a gale yet, the wind was definitely picking up. I could hear the wind blowing now. The first time I'd ever done so on Titan. And dust was thick in the air. "Mizozi, look at this." "Give me a minute," she said. She sounded annoyed, as she often was when interrupted. But when she saw what was outside the window, she fell silent. She saw the same thing I did. Hundreds of tiny red points of light born in the wind. Bioluminescence? I don't know, but we've never seen anything else on Titan do that. She'd opened the door before I could say anything else, and she was bounding back towards the riverbed, wind or no wind. "Get back here," I called. "We've got to—" But I saw she wasn't listening, and I went out to get her. I reached the slope where she was standing, and this time I was the one who fell silent. The winds were swirling in the riverbed, channeled by its sides, and they carried red constellations in their wake. And below them, the vinyl bug colonies had erupted in a riot of blue and green. "Look," Mizozi said. "The more lights that are in the air, the more on the ground. It's some kind of quorum sensing. The bugs in the colonies can sense the density of the ones on the wind. Maybe they're sensing how often the wind-borne ones hit them." By now, she'd stopped talking to me and was theorizing purely to herself, and she seemed rooted to the spot. "Mizozi, we've got to get out of here. You've got your recordings. Let's go." But it was already too late. Lightning flashed above the ridgeline, and methane rained down from the clouds in thick, oily drops. Above us, the rain was starting to stream down the wadis. In minutes, the riverbed would be a torrent. Lightning flashed again, and the wind rose to a crescendo, and it was suddenly hard to stand upright. "The tent!" Mizozi cried, and even as she did so, the wind ripped its stakes from the ice and it went flying into Titan's sky. Both of us raced for the rover, the vinyl bugs forgotten, thinking only of escaping to lower ground. I reached the door, opened it, got into the driver's seat, and opened the throttle. We'd gone less than 300 meters when it happened. The rover drove over a small outcropping, raising the driver's side higher than the passenger side, and, just then, a gust of wind picked it up from underneath. I had no time to react, and could only sit there in horror as it rolled over, slid, and lodged in a crevice between two folds of ice. Outside, the wind had risen to a roar. Inside, the engine was silent and still. By one of God's small blessings, neither Mizozi nor I was seriously hurt. I was shaken, bruised, bleeding in a couple of places, but all my limbs answered and nothing was broken. Mizozi wasn't quite as well off. She had a cut in her scalp and I could see blood trickling down the side of her face, but she too had no broken bones and none of her injuries were life-threatening. Our suits were somewhat of a greater blessing. If they had torn, or if the hookup for replenishing the air supply had been damaged, we'd have been done for. But, even on a shoestring, we'd made sure the equipment that really mattered could take a beating, and the suits had come through with flying colors. We couldn't take them off, and not being able to clean and bandage the cuts wasn't ideal, but the bleeding would stop soon on its own, and we'd cleaned them with sterile wipes last night. We could survive. The rover had come to rest with the passenger side on top, so Mizozi opened her door and pulled herself out. I followed suit a second later. I had to pull myself up 2 meters to clamber out the door. But that was an easy task in Titan's gravity, even for an injured man. Outside, in the lee of the rover, we took stock. The engine was dead. I'd look later to see if it could be fixed, but for now, it wasn't taking us anywhere. The ice melter and the electrolysis plant, though, were still working on battery power. We would still have air and drinking water, and Mizozi stopping for more ice on the way suddenly seemed wise in retrospect. The radio, too, was working. We found that out a moment later when we called Colossal Station. "We've got a situation here, Victoria," I said. "That sounds like a bit of an understatement. The rover's dead, but we're all right. Can you send someone up here?" The silence stretched out a long moment. "Not in this weather. The wind, the rivers between you and us, it's too risky. Can you wait until the storm blows out?" I thought about that. Maybe, if it only lasts a day or two. But storms on Titan could last 4 days, and I didn't think the battery would last that long. "We'll get someone out to you as soon as we can," said Victoria. But we all knew that might not be soon enough, and I wasn't very hopeful when I cut the transmission. Mizozi and I sank down to the ground and sat cross-legged in the pouring methane. The rover sheltered us from the wind. There was that, at least, and we leaned against it and took some time to recover. "They're not really different at all," Mizozi said after a few minutes. I wondered what that could possibly mean, here in the middle of a hydrocarbon gale, and I had no answer. "The vinyl bugs, here and in the lake, they're the same. It must be their life cycle. During the seasons, the bugs in the lake absorb energy and the ones in the mountains reproduce. But when the season changes, they switch places. The wind blows the lake bugs out here, and the rivers bring the mountain bugs to the lake." It seemed absurd to talk about vinyl bugs here and now, but I was drawn in despite myself. "What about the adhesive organelle?" "They must be able to swap genetic code like bacteria do. When the lake bugs get blown onto the mountains bugs give them the code they need to make the glue. That must be what the quorum sensing is for. Maybe the colors are a signal to match the bugs that have the code with the ones that need it. Maybe they get something in exchange. Yes, I know I'm guessing, but imagine." She was guessing, but something made me certain she was right. "And breaking down the adhesive, that might be quorum sensing too," I said. I was caught up in the speculation now. It starts when the density of the bugs blowing in from the lake reaches one level and accelerates at a higher level. One code to start the migration and another to finish. Through the haze and rain, I could see Mizozi nod. "We've got years of work ahead of us," she said. "But we've found the treasure." "We've got years of work ahead if we can last the next few days." The thought goaded me to my feet, and I went to look at the engine. If we could fix it and get the rover upright, we might have a chance. But when I opened the hood, I looked upon disaster. The timing chain had snapped, and 2 of the cylinder heads were warped and bent. I could fix that in the shop at the station, but not up here. "It wouldn't make a difference anyway," said Mizozi, who'd come up behind me. You heard Victoria. We'd have to cross rivers to get home. She looked over to the river that had lately held the vinyl bug colonies, and I followed her eyes with my own. It had become a raging flood, full of ice rocks washed down from the ridge. No, a rover couldn't cross that. Maybe it's not too far to walk, I ventured, but thought better of the idea, even as I voiced it. And microgravity. We could cover 40 kilometers fast enough that our suit's oxygen and heat wouldn't be exhausted. And we might even be able to jump the rivers with a running start. But one wrong move in these winds? We'd be rolling downhill the rest of the way, Mzozi said, completing the thought. We'd truly be Colosso's children. I burst out in sudden laughter, tinged with hysteria, but laughter all the same. We all knew the story of Edward Mukuka Colosso, who decided 100 years ago that Zambia should build rockets and send missionaries to Mars. He'd recruited cadet astronauts, including a 17-year-old schoolgirl. Mzozi liked that, and set up a training camp. That was the time when Zambia was truly poor, so he trained them for zero gravity by rolling them downhill in 200-liter oil drums. The project had never gone anywhere, not in the 1960s, but for all its absurdity, Colosso had something of the visionary in him. He dreamed of going to space on a poor man's budget, and that dream had smoldered in us for a century until we found a place where we could do just that. Naming the station after him had been whimsy. We'd all been drunk when we voted to do it, but there was also something more. If you find any barrels, Mzozi said, let me know. There weren't any barrels, but maybe, if Colosso's spirit inspired us, there were other things we could scavenge. We could use spare tenting material to trap waste heat. We could cannibalize everything that had a battery, the radio, the printer, the data sets if we had to. It wouldn't be comfortable if we had to stay in the suits for 4 days, but maybe we could make them last. Or maybe we won't need to, I said. Maybe we can fly. Fly? Said Mzozi. It wasn't really a question, and I knew what she was thinking. People could fly on Titan. With gravity a seventh of Earth's and an atmosphere half again as thick, muscle power and strapped-on wings were enough to get humans into the air. We'd both done it. Chilimbe Kwemi, our materials man, had made a few sets of Mylar wings for Colosso Station, and we sometimes used them for short-haul trips or just for fun. But none of us had ever tried to find out if muscle power could keep us going for 40 kilometers, and none of us had flown in gale force winds. A downdraft or a bad crosswind will slam us into the mountainside, she said carefully. Not if we get enough height. And look, I pointed towards the space beyond the rover, where vinyl bugs were flickering in the wind. As long as they're glowing, they'll point the way. We look for the lights ahead of us. If we see them move suddenly downward, we know to steer around them. We'll follow them around the eye of the storm all the way home. Mzozi stood there for a long moment, not saying a word. I could see she was still skeptical. I could also see that the idea called to her. She made a motion as if counting on her fingers, and she had a figuring expression on her face. The batteries probably won't last, she said. Let's make some wings. We dove into the locker behind the rover cab. We scavenged, as true children of Colosso would do. We could use the spare tenting for the wing surface and straps, and Mzozi grabbed some and began cutting it down. For struts? But no, there was nothing in the locker or in the toolboxes that was long enough to keep the wings rigid. Was there something on the rover chassis that could work? No, the metal was too heavy, and it would take too long to cut with the tools we had. Mzozi, I said, is the printer working? She climbed into the rover cab, hanging upside down halfway through the passenger door, and tried turning it on. "No," she said, "but I can see what's wrong. I can fix it." She disappeared fully into the cab, and a moment later, I was the one hanging through the passenger door and bracing myself on the gear shifts. "3 to base," I said, keying the radio. "Can you get me Chilambe?" Within minutes, I heard Chilambe's voice. "What do you need?" "I've got the data unit hooked up. Can you send me your patterns for wing struts? I'd have to fine-tune them, but they'll give me a place to start." "Coming," he said, and a moment later, "Check your mail." I did, and the pattern was there. Back outside, I opened the pattern and designed feverishly. I measured the wings that Mizozi had cut. The fastenings would do, but the main struts would need to be shorter than the pattern called for, and they'd have to be thicker if it were going to survive the winds. The secondaries would also need to be stronger, and if I could improvise Mortise and tenon connections between them and the struts... "The printer's online," called Mizozi, and I climbed back up and connected the unit. There was just enough plastic and enough water to keep it from cooling too fast. Stopping for more ice on the way had definitely been a good idea. And though the printer seemed maddeningly slow, it took less than an hour before we had our parts and fastenings. Mizozi took a last look at her samples, but even she shook her head. "They'll keep," she said. "Lulanda will come back for them if she has to walk the whole way." She strapped the wings to her arms and, again in the rover's lee, stood up with them outstretched. She suddenly seemed an alien being, a winged figure standing against an orange sky with Saturn behind her, a figure that would have been beyond my great-grandparents' imagination. Or, suddenly the thought came to me, maybe not. I wasn't Lamba, but growing up in Ndula, I'd heard Lamba stories, and one of them was that of the Awantu, people who lived on and maintained the sun, moon, and stars. In the stories, the Awantu weren't gods or spirits, but people of another creation, with different ancestors, but people just like us. Maybe we were the Awantu now. Maybe space had always been our destiny. And before I could continue the thought any further, Mizozi ran with the wind, jumped, and flew. If I had any second thoughts, I had to abandon them now. Whatever lay ahead in the winds, I would 10 times rather face it than remain alone in the storm, a billion miles from home. I, too, crept out from the shelter, broke into a run, and took flight. It was like nothing I'd ever done before. In the calm of northern winter, I'd had to work hard to get lift, but that wasn't a problem now. The wind caught my wings and practically threw me into the air. But it didn't stop throwing me. I was buffeted by cross currents, tossed aside by eddies, thrown from side to side and up and down. I was moving at speeds I thought were impossible, but it took all my effort to keep a course. I strained to see the vinyl bug's lights, but they were hard to catch in the swirling haze. They weren't as dense in the air as they'd been on the riverbed, so their quorum sensing was weaker and fewer of them had activated their bioluminescence. When I did finally see flickering in front of me, it was too late. I saw them sink into a sudden downdraft and flapped my wings desperately, but the wind blowing me after them was too powerful. The force of the downdraft was like a hammer, and for a horrifying second I thought it would rip the wings from my arms. I lost purchase and tumbled, almost in free fall, spiraling towards the icy hills. Elias Yaluma, 2032 to 2068, I thought, and wondered if anyone would come back to erect a grave marker. I wrenched my wings around in a last attempt to avoid being dashed against the surface. It was more a prayer than anything done with forethought, but somehow it worked. The wings propelled me out of the downdraft, and I steadied myself again. I looked for Mizozi and saw her ahead and far above. I climbed toward her. putting distance between me and the ground. At 500 meters, I felt safer. At 1,000, I was almost comfortable. I realized that steering was becoming easier, that I was getting the feel of the winds. I was learning to fly. Or so I thought. I soon learned how much Titan still had to teach me. By now, we were flying almost parallel to the mountains, and crosswinds came in every time we passed a rift or river valley. When they met the main storm, the turbulence was vicious. The struts creaked and bent as I fought to right myself. I was too high now to plummet to the ground, but as the winds buffeted and tossed me, one of them blew a knot of vinyl bugs into my faceplate, and I had to strain to see. For a terrifying second, I thought that the red glow was blood, but then I realized it was on the outside of my suit, and a moment later I shook it clear. I flew hard to get out of the crossdrafts and catch up with Mizozi, and just as I did, a crosswind blew in from the last of the upland valleys. From somewhere, it had picked up a motherload of vinyl bugs, and they flashed like a galaxy as we flew into them. "A million stars to guide us," Mizozi said over the suit radio. She dove and swooped through the vinyl bugs and climbed out the other side. She was enjoying herself. And suddenly, I realized that in spite of all the terror, so was I. People had dreamed of flight as long as people had dreamed. And even if the storm killed me a second from now, the dream had been made real. I dove after her, and points of light surrounded me as they had, long ago on Earth, when I'd gone to swim in a phosphorescent bay. We followed the bugs around the edge of the storm. The air was less fierce now that we were headed towards the lake, and we were high enough to let the winds carry us, so I dared to look down. It was all laid out beneath me. The mountain range, the icy volcanoes, the rivers winding down to the lowlands, a system as large as the Zambezi, even if it only flowed at an interval of years. We were above the coastal plain now. Wind-swept dune fields lay below us, and Krakenmare dead ahead, already filling with vinyl bugs from the mountains, and dispersing them to the next stage of their life cycle. A sudden cross-draft and creaking struts reminded me that I'd better pay attention, but I could see the lights of Colosso Station now, and just ahead, Mizozi started to descend. It wouldn't be easy to land in the storm, but what, since we'd come here, had ever been easy? We flew lower and lower, guiding ourselves toward home. Below, where the rivers flowed into Krakenmare, a million stars were shining.
And that's our story. This story checks a lot of my favorite boxes: exploration, scientists at work, survival in nature, ingenuity, and adventure. I love how resourceful the main characters are, and how they care as much about their discoveries and samples as they do about their personal safety and well-being. I also really liked the international picture that's painted of who gets to explore this new planet. Edward in Colosso was a real person with a real dream, albeit one that wasn't particularly well realized. But his story shows that the dream of space exploration doesn't belong to any one segment of humanity. Like the story of The Boy Who Harnessed the Wind, which you can find on Netflix, this story shows that growing up with hardship can shape incredibly smart, creative, and resourceful people. People who can fly home, whether that home is Zambia, Malawi, or among the stars. Come back next week for a story about connections across the multiverse. Escape Pod is a production of Escape Artists Inc. and is brought to you with a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives license. Don't change it, don't sell it. Please do go forth and share it. If you'd like to support Escape Pod, please rate or review us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite app. We are 100% audience supported, and we count on your donations to keep the lights on and the servers humming. You can donate via patreon.com by searching for Escape Artists, or via PayPal through our website, escapepod.org. Patreon subscribers now have access to exclusive merchandise and can automatically be added to our Discord. Our opening and closing music is by Daikaiju at daikaiju.org. And our closing quotation this week is from a Zambian proverb which says, "When you run alone, you run fast. When you run together, you run far." Thanks for joining us, and enjoy your auditory adventures through time and space.